In previous videos, I've talked about how American politics swings left and right, liberal, conservative, right? For example, at the beginning of this course, we talked about Reconstruction, which was much more of a liberal type of government. And then it swings off to the right and goes into a more conservative government during the Gilded Age. And then, of course, the Progressive era swings it back to the left when it comes to the liberal side of American politics. The 1920s is certainly a reaction to the Progressive era. It's going to swing back to the right. It's going to swing back to the conservative era. The first point you need to make about the 1920s in terms of its politics is that when World War I ends in 1919, the American people, generally speaking, are tired and they're disillusioned. They're tired of crusades. They're tired of cleaning up all that was wrong with the Gilded Age. And of course, they're tired of the fact that World War I was a crusade to make the world safe for democracy and all of that, yet it didn't pan out, right? It's one of those things that you have to make sure that if you're gonna promise, you have to deliver. And Wilson definitely overpromised and underdelivered. What Americans wanted to do back in the 1920s is go back to business as usual. Enough of trying to save the world. Let's just go back to the business at hand. The business as usual basically be marked by non-inspiring, non-heroic leaders. I challenge you right now. Think of a president of the United States elected in the 1920s. It's hard to do, right? I'll give you one, however. It's going to be Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge said that the business of America was business, and that summarizes the attitude of the United States. We'll come back to that later. The country's politics, its government, and everything is turned over to business in the 1920s. However, it's got a different attitude than it was in the Gilded Age, when businesses ran the country. Remember that during the Gilded Age, the attitude was laissez-faire, and it turned into the survival of the fittest, right? In the 1920s, we don't go back to that kind of attitude. We go rather, the argument is about turning the country over to business was good for the public good. They actually talked about something called welfare capitalism. If you want to help people, don't have the government in the business of regulating and protecting. Instead, let American business run America, and everybody's going to prosper. Now, what this sets up is it's going to turn the country over to business in order to provide this welfare capitalism. And as long as everybody is doing well, it's okay. But as soon as things collapse, who's going to get blamed? Businesses, right? So keep that in mind, because I'm telling you how the country/government was turned over to business and how then it worked out in the reality. To show you the post-war reaction about being disillusioned, let's look at a couple of things that happened right after World War I. One was labor unrest. Generally speaking, organized labor supported the war effort for World War I. Therefore, they agreed not to strike. The war effort was much more important than their individual issues. When the war was over, however, they found that they had fallen behind. Their wages had not increased, while prices were going up, especially after the war. So they wanted to catch up, and when that happens, you're going to see a bunch of labor strikes. For example, in 1919, there were probably more strikes in that year than there had been in the last 40 years. In all sorts of things, coal mining, steel, etc. And generally speaking, the public reaction was going back to the old manner of supporting management. One concrete example of this was the Boston police force. You see, the Boston police force tried to make a union because they believed that they were falling behind. When they did that, they were fired for union activity. With no police patrolling the city, crime skyrockets. And first, the Boston police is going to, Boston is going to be they're going to try to police Boston with a volunteer force made up of college students, like from Harvard. I can't imagine that happening today, right? That didn't work too well. So the National Guard is called in to police Boston, right? The striking police said finally they'd given up and they were willing to go back to work. But the authorities in Boston had Boston under control. And they basically said, no, you're not going to come back to work. Now they had to basically get a new police force trained, i.e. the strikers were fired permanently. At that point, the Samuel Gompers, remember the AFL? He tried to intervene. He, in fact, tried to go all the way to the governor of Massachusetts, and that guy was Calvin Coolidge at the time. He pleaded with Coolidge to let workers go back to work, and Coolidge said no and gave a famous statement. Let me give it to you. There is no right to strike against the public safety by anyone, anywhere, at any time. This makes Coolidge a hero. Now, he's right, but isn't there something more to that statement? If there's no right to strike against public safety, perhaps the public should treat their public employees correctly in the first place. Yet that part was ignored. The strike failed, and the public will back Coolidge.